Hello, everyone. Today's paper is about the internet and higher education, which is a top journal in the field of higher education or even in the field of education. So this is a very recent article published in 2021. And it examines the relationship between self-efficacy and one's online learning engagement. And the study site is MOOCs courses. And they adopted, as you may already find, they adopted a psychological theory in order to do the analysis of this study. In the abstract, they present their problem statement, which is in MOOCs nowadays, although it is very popular and is creating more opportunities for students everywhere to learn. However, the problem is the low completion rate, and it is hard. It seems to be very hard for students to engage very actively online. By engaging, they mean, for example, posting, replying in the discussion forum, and also to actively thinking and keep pace with this course content. With a variety of activities. So the engagement of learners in online learning in those MOOCs for even university students are not that good. So they are wondering whether maybe a psychological mechanism might provide some explanation about that. And maybe if we find the relationships among those different factors, we may come up with a better way to support learners, online learners, to better engage them and to improve the completion rate of those online courses. So specifically, they adopted several psychological theories, including social cognitive view of learning and hardiness theory, by which they mean like the hardiness, like the attitude of taking a hard step towards the course. For example, if I say I meet a challenge, but I have the confidence to overcome that challenge. That's what they called hardiness, academic hardiness, and that they deem it as an important mediating factor for one to perform well, especially in their learning engagement in MOOCs. So they essentially make this a key factor in their study. And then the other two important factors are what they mentioned in the title. So the self-efficacy, which is their self-confidence, learners' self-confidence, and the results, which is measured by a survey. So the learning engagement, behaviors, and attitudes of learners. So they basically, the methodology is they used self-reported scales to measure the learning engagement, their students' self-efficacy, and how they kind of overcome the challenges in their online learning process. So they used those self-reported scales, in other words, surveys, to collect their data. And then for their data analysis, they use a structural equation modeling, which is they build a model based on theory in terms of how those three factors relate to each other, with this hardiness, academic hardiness factor being the mediator, the learning engagement being the outcome, and the self-efficacy being the key kind of factor, the variable. So they built up a framework, theoretical framework, to take it as a basic model, and they use structural equation modeling to see what is like based on the data, what is the parameters for those weights for those relationships among those three three variables. So they also highlights that they are taking a holistic approach to view learning engagement. It is not only general internet-based learning self-efficacy that contribute to learning engagement, but also some of the functional internet-based learning self-efficacy are also examined. And they say they get mixed results, and in the following several pages you will see what they find. So again, in the introduction, they highlight the problem statement, which is the highlight course completion rate is low, and then they introduce that this key factor, which is self-efficacy, and they wonder whether this self-efficacy has something to do with this learning engagement. And they defined learning engagement in terms of social engagement, and they say like they reviewed the factor of self-regulated learning and situational interest are playing significant roles for one's online engagement. And they say that's why they have this motivation, because like different people are finding different roles of those self-efficacy, the influence of that on learning engagement, and the inconsistent results triggered the author's motivation to initiate this study. They are wondering how different forms of self-efficacy influence learning engagement. And they point out several other problems, like those missing links and gaps when discussing self-efficacy and learning engagement. And they discuss the details about what are the detailed even sub-factors under this thing we call self-efficacy, including those attitudes. And they point out these hardy attitudes, which they define as the beliefs and courage to turn academic challenges from burden into profitable growth. So this factor, this hardy attitudes, is pointed out as a mediating role, as playing a mediating role in the relationship between self-efficacy and learning engagement. And they talked more about the links, like there are studies saying there are verified direct and indirect links between self-efficacy and learning engagement. And also hardiness is also pointed out in those literatures. And here, towards the end of the introduction, they pointed out the current gaps in the literature, and they say they're going to formulating a conceptual framework via developing hypothesis in the following section, the literature review. So they, in the literature review, they defined the three key term, which is learning engagement, self-efficacy, and academic hardiness. And they also pointed out why they are important and what are the potential relationships among those three variables. They first defined online learning engagement, which is kind of the key, the outcome focused by this study. They highlight that it is very important for students to have high level of learning engagement, and by definition, learning engagement are the time and energy students devote to educationally sound activities inside and outside of the classroom. So several activities that are engaging students. So it is important to examine this learning engagement because it is positively related to students' multiple skills. And then they, after they setting up the importance of learning engagement, they introduced the psychological mechanisms approach that they're using to examine learning engagement. So they say maybe learning engagement is critically related to learning outcomes, but also related to motivations and other psychological factors, especially self-efficacy. So that's how they introduced this second key term, self-efficacy, and they situated the discussion of those two key terms in the context of MOOC environment, because this is the study site, kind of virtual study site of this study. And then they pointed out the specific difficulties of attaining students' attention and engagement in MOOCs. And they're wondering what factors can increase students' engagement, specifically through a psychological point of view. And they are then pointing out the literature, because this is the literature review section, right? So they're pointing out different features and interventions that scholars has made in terms of improving MOOC learners' learning engagement. And then they find this learning engagement is a multi-dimensional thing. It's not only behavioral, but also cognitive and emotional. And that's then they are saying they're taking this holistic approach to view learning engagement. And they also pointed out the research gaps, which is there are less investigated of this relationship between self-efficacy and hardiness with learning engagement in MOOCs environment. And they continue to introduce this key term we call academic hardiness. Again, they defined it, and then they are saying what is the background of attitude hardiness is introduced, which is not MOOCs. It is in traditional face-to-face academic setting. So this is a gap. Like nobody is examining hardiness, academic hardiness in the MOOCs setting. So they're going to fill that gap by doing this study. So they have a more specific and detailed definition here about academic hardiness. So it means commitment, control, and challenge. And then it serves as the attitude and beliefs that support students to sustain learning. So there might be some relationship between this hardiness and learning engagement. And that's how they did the second key term definition and background. And then they finally moved to this self-efficacy variable, and they related it with learning outcomes. And they especially highlights the computer self-efficacy and defined it as learners' perceived ability to accomplish tasks using computers. So how confident the learner is feeling about to complete the online learning with computers. And the web-based learning efficacy is defined and introduced in terms of its importance to learning outcomes. And then after this literature review, a conceptual framework is being established. So the main difference between this literature review and conceptual framework is in the previous section, in the literature review, the definition, the background and importance of those three terms are introduced, while less is about the relationship, the interaction among those three things. So the conceptual framework here is specifically focusing on the relationships and interactions among those things. So firstly, the claim is online academic hardiness is necessary for online learning engagement. So that's the first relationship among those things. And they accordingly, they have this first hypothesis, which is between hardiness and learning engagement. And then the second hypothesis is about the relationship between self-efficacy and learning engagement. And they say their hypothesis is there is a relationship. And then that's their second hypothesis. So they argue a lot about why self-efficacy is so important for learning engagement. Then they move to their last hypothesis, which is self-efficacy has this positive indirect effect on learning engagement, which is then mediated by this third factor called online academic hardiness. So they have this three hypotheses, then they raised their research question, which is first, does online academic hardiness have a mediating effect on learning engagement? And then what is the relationship of those three things, including self-efficacy, learning engagement, and this mediator hardiness? After they introduced their theoretical framework, their hypothesis, and their research question, they come to this point to introduce their method. As we already covered in the abstract section, they are using a structural modeling, structural equation modeling, so which they have to have a graph like this. So to represent the different relationships, the mediator, the variable, and the outcomes in the graph. So that's what SEM usually do in their method section. They also introduced their participants. They're saying all the participants are Chinese-speaking learners, and they collected 665 respondents from a self-reported scale measuring students' learning engagement, self-efficacy, and academic hardiness. And they present the demographic factors in this table, and they also explained the instrument, which is the scale, the 5-point Likert rating self-reported scale they used to collect the data. So they also specifically using a few extra tags to explain what are the scale and the theories behind that survey they used for each key term. So for hardiness, they used this online academic hardiness scale. For learning engagement, they used this online learning engagement scale. And then for self-efficacy, they have this self-efficacy scale based, which by which they just want to show that their skills are kind of rigorous because they are based on some mature theoretical framework, and the scale is already established in the field. So after they introduce those surveys they used to collect data, then they introduced how they analyze the data. So basically SEM, structural equation modeling. And they then present the results. So they first did a measurement validation. They are saying the reliability and validity are good. So the study results should be reliable. And then they test the structural model. Like I said, those are the parameters, the weights of the relationship, like how the change in self-efficacy can change the commitment in this hardiness. And as a result, the two things combined can then influence behavioral engagement. And there are 44% of the variance can be explained by the model. So that's just one example. You can use that for those other weights, the explanation of those other weights and parameters here in this graph. They also explained especially how different items are excluded or included based on this courtesis statistics, and to just make sure that this structural model is measuring the main effect. So they basically verified that this model exists. The hardiness is the mediator. Self-efficacy has a direct positive link to influence learning engagement. So that's basically their finding. And especially the highlight self-efficacy show a significant positive relationship with online learning engagement, and online academic hardiness is a critical mediator. They argue that their study are significant, both theoretically and practically, because they can help those instructors in MOOCs to support students' learning engagement by supporting their self-efficacy and supporting their to cultivate their academic hardiness. And also in theory, they provide a holistic approach to examine learning engagement, specifically focusing on self-efficacy and academic hardiness as the psychological mechanism influencing this learning outcome. So that's about it. They also appended those scales at the end in the appendix, just in case if the reader is wanting to know about what questions are asked from the participants. So that's this paper on internet and higher education. I may introduce more, and I may introduce and share more papers in this journal, because this journal is currently the most popular journal in education, and the citation fact that the citations of this journal is probably the highest in the field, and it represents a trend in education of incorporating technology in education and focusing on learning analytics and how to support online version of education. So hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.